Hello, everyone, and welcome. This is the launch today of a report produced by the Ethical Journalism Network on the media situation in Ukraine. We're going to have a discussion about the report's contents, and I hope we're going to be able to focus some attention on the priorities that need to be given to support for journalists and media, independent media organizations in Ukraine. First of all, I just want to, if I can, say a few words about the report itself. The report is the final part in a jigsaw project of reports carried out by the EJN into the media situation in various countries of Europe, and finishing off this project with Ukraine seems to be the absolutely appropriate way to deal with it, because in Ukraine we see a concentration of many of the problems that exist in the post-Soviet world, and I think it's really very important that our report today will have real significance in terms of how we see and how we can support the media in Ukraine, but also looking at slightly wider, how we can see and equally support media throughout the region. This project has been carried out by the Ethical Journalism Network, which is a global network supporting journalists and media organizations striving for media independence and high quality professional journalism. We've been supported in this work by the Evans Foundation, and we're very grateful for the support that they've given us, which has allowed this report and other activities to be carried out. We've also had support from the European Union through an important education and development project organized by Destin over the past few years. And we've also received some support from the Norwegian media freedom support organization, Fritt. To all of them, we say thank you very much, and we're very grateful to have been able to put together this report. The report itself is very challenging. It began as a sort of an investigation into the situation in Ukraine before the latest conflict broke out more than a year ago. And the media scene is surveyed in a detailed report, which we have here. And this report is available online. One can pick it up. You can have a look at it. The report is also buttressed by a number of important essays which look at various aspects of the challenges that are facing journalists. And those are the questions of the role of journalists, for example, in investigative journalism, combating corruption, the challenge that journalists face in trying to produce unbiased reporting material in the midst of a conflict. And the importance of education and training and media development in helping to create an enabling environment in which journalists are confident, well-trained, and able to report freely. So this report is as up to date as we can make it in a fast-changing situation. So we ask you to read it, and we particularly ask you to read the detailed recommendations at the end. The detailed recommendations, there are more than 30 of them, are seeking to do a number of things. One is to put a focus on the need to support in Ukraine the journalists and media organizations that are trying to build a professional environment. So we're focusing on particularly education, media education, the need to reform, restructure, and improve the educational and training framework for journalists across Ukraine. Secondly, there's the need to ensure that journalists continue to be protected. The threats that face journalists are absolutely terrible. The number of attacks and killings of journalists in the latest conflict are there to be seen. I think the number is around 15 journalists have been killed so far. That is likely to go up. Unfortunately, that's the reality of how these things are. But Ukraine has never been an entirely safe place for journalists. We know, and I've known, working here in Brussels for the International Federation of Journalists for many years, I know that in Ukraine, dissident journalists, independent journalists were sometimes targeted for their work, and there have been a number of cases of where journalists have suffered even before the conflict began. So the issue of safety of journalists and the need to identify and hold to account the people who are responsible for attacks on media and the killing of journalists is a high priority, and it's really given the significance that it deserves within this report. The report also looks at the need for the international community, particularly the international community of media, to work together to support media in Ukraine. And we highlight a number of actions that are being taken by the media support organizations, and we'll hear later on from our panel exactly what that means. So that question of sort of continuing media support and helping to develop the media scene in Ukraine is absolutely essential. What we're seeing here in the report is really there are two strands which I think are important to highlight. One is what we can do now in practical terms to support media and journalism in Ukraine, and what we can do as part of the media scene, but also what the international community can do. The international organizations are particularly important, and we look to more international support is the call that we feel most strongly. So we have, that's the broad outline of the report, and we hope that you will read it, and we hope that you'll give us feedback on what we can do. What I'd like to do now is to move on very quickly and introduce the panel that we've got here in Brussels, who are going to be complementing what we will hear from Ukraine. I've got with me some old friends and who are experts in their own fields. Adeline Hulin, who's with me, is from UNESCO. She's very much involved in the work related to freedom of expression and European Union partnerships with UNESCO. And UNESCO have always been a great friend of in all aspects of the support for media that I've talked about. Next to her, I've got Jean-Paul Matos, who has done almost everything that is good that can be done in journalism in a really distinguished career. He's a former editor. He's worked for Human Rights Watch as a European director. He's constantly writing, tweeting, and telling us and giving us access to his rich experience and so on. Jean-Paul is one of my best friends and one of the best journalists in this region. So I'm really pleased that he was able to join us. He has also written one of the essays in the report, which is actually a very significant one and by no means easy to write, which is the essay that's talking about how you can be an unbiased journalist in the midst of a conflict. So good luck with that when we get around to that discussion. And the third one, colleague that I've got with me is Tom Law, from the Deputy Director of the Global Forum for Media Development. Tom, it's really nice to see you. He's an old friend of mine. He worked with me through the launch of the Ethical Journalism Network and had done tremendous work. If the Ethical Journalism Network is really sort of working and humming along today, which I know it is, a lot of it is due to the work that Tom put in at that time. So thank you very much, Tom, and thanks for coming. So we've got this panel here in Brussels, and we will hear from them later on. But I think what we should do now is we should actually go to Ukraine and let's hear from our colleagues there. The people on the ground in Ukraine and the journalists and media organizations have had enormous problems. Of course, and that's easy to see. The fact of the matter is that perhaps the biggest struggle is that in the midst of a patriotic war and a war for sovereignty and a war to win back territories that has been lost and lands that have been lost, the challenge for journalists is to maintain your equilibrium, your independence and your professionalism and so on. And the Ukraine journalists have more than risen to that challenge. And I think it was no surprise that they received a Pulitzer Award last year for the courage and determination they've shown. So our report and what we've done is very much a tribute to them and a tribute to the work that they've done. And the first speaker I'd like to introduce is Lena Kush, who's the first secretary of the National Union of Journalists of Ukraine, a member of the European Federation of Journalists, and an organization that I myself have had good personal contact with for many years in the past. So Lina, thank you very much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, dear Aidan, for inviting me to discuss with panelists and to discuss such an important topic. I represent the largest journalist organization from Ukraine with 80,000 members and 24 regional organizations, and I will try to give you some impression and some insights how Ukrainian journalists work now and what their needs are. I would like to start from telling about three areas on which we as a union were focused during the last 2 weeks. First, we analyzed the experience of journalists worked in Kherson and covered the flood after Russia blew up the dam in Kakhovka. For the first time, journalists faced two dangers were combined at once, the water and shelling. We provided newsrooms and news teams the safety equipment, bulletproof vests and helmets, but it turned out that bulletproof vests absorb water, get wet and pull under the water, pull down. It was dangerous for journalists, and 3 volunteers died because they couldn't immediately release themselves from the bulletproof vests. That's why journalists who boarded the boat either left the bulletproof vest in the car, or they put them on the bottom of the boat, and when the shelling began, they lay down and took cover. And everyone had to make their own decision about their own safety, a hard decision. The ethical challenge for journalists who worked in Kherson was to enter the boat or not during the first days, because entering the journalist to the boat meant that they take place from everyone need evacuation. And I know journalists from big media who refused to enter the boats during the first 2 days. The request for the safety of journalists was the first request to us as a union after the invasion last year. Today, the request for the safety equipment and safety training and safety skills remains actual. 10 days ago, we held in the third radiation safety training at our journalist solidarity centers in Zaporizhia. Why in Zaporizhia? You understand, because there is a nuclear plant mined by Russia nearby. And this week we expect an important shipment from our foreign partner, one of our foreign partners, to cross the border, radiation safety protecting clothing, and decontamination kits that are intended for journalists. I hope that the custom clearance, we can pass quickly the custom clearance. The network of journalist solidarity centers was created last year, and today we supported by our international partners, International Federation of Journalists, European Federation of Journalists, and UNESCO. We run 6 centers, including 2 at the front line in Dnipro and Zaporizhia, that provided assistance to more than 3,000 journalists. I am sitting in such center in Kiev. Behind me, you can see our logo and banners. And if we had 5 minutes during the discussion, I could show you later how the center looks like from the inside. And A special feature of this center is that it's a hub that can provide various types of assistance to journalists, from protective equipment and trainings to a workplace with laptops and internet. This is a good experience and good examples how international aid works. We are in closely contact with many of participants of this discussion, and I'm pleased to see here Tom and representatives of Reporters Without Borders, UNESCO, European and Federation and International Federation of Journalists, and I appreciate Brussels Press Club, which I visited in January. And the third important area where we have the results of our effort is the resuming of almost 30 local newspapers in their occupied and frontline territories. I'm ready to show you, maybe you know about several today in Orikhiv, a frontline city in Zaporizhia region, was destroyed building where a shelter for civilian residents was located. But it was the shelter where volunteers delivered a local newspaper along with food and water. Here is the local newspaper from Orikhiv, 2 or 3 kilometers from the front line. And this newspaper was resumed their work thanks to National Union of Journalists of Ukraine. And after that, we appealed to our international partners to support, to continue support of this newspaper. Here is the why it's important. Maybe I read your study, the IDAN, and there is a lot of attention, a lot of information about working all Ukrainian newspapers or all Ukrainian media. But I would like to attract your attention to the local media, because as to Orikhiv, for example, there are no electricity, there are no internet, there are no TV signal in the city, and the only information source for local citizens who are still there in the shelter is local newspaper only. Here is the newspaper for Kherson. It's the regional newspaper. For Izium, for district in Sumy region, it's close to Russia border, close to Belgorod region in Russia, and they are they have several shelling too, and many for Kharkiv region, for Chernihiv, for Mykolaiv region, and for other regions. So the local media and their work maybe is not so visible from abroad, but it's crucially important for Ukrainians. This war showed us the important role of journalists. In the first hours after the dam, New Kherson war blew up, the world media discussed about only version who is responsible for this, maybe Ukraine or maybe Russia. And only after the journalists risked their lives to report from Kherson, show the evacuation, and people suffered because of this situation. After that, the world started talking about the humanitarian disaster and ecological disaster. We know what role the reports of journalists from Mariupol or Bucha played in this war. So this is the answer to the question why it's necessary to continue to support Ukrainian journalists. We presented last week research about the needs of local newsrooms and Ukrainian journalists now, and I can share some information later during the discussion, as well the examples of about ethical and professional challenges for Ukrainian journalists. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I mean, that's a very sobering intervention on your part, Lina. You've described very, very well the awful situation that's facing not just the journalists, but the people that they're writing their stories for in Kherson and elsewhere. And I think you've highlighted a number of issues which are incredibly important. And I think the focus on local journalism and the need to support local journalism is certainly something that's been taken up in the report and is one of the major aims that we have adopted, which is to try to ensure more international recognition of the need to support local journalism, and that needs to be translated into practical support. Thank you very much indeed for that, and we'll come back to you and talk to you later on some of the other issues you raised. I want to now turn to Andrei Kulikov. Andrei is the chair of the Ukraine Ethics Commission. The Ukraine Ethics Commission is a remarkable body, it seems to me, because it continues to function as a self-regulatory body in the midst of the conflict and in the midst of the war. And I think that there are enormous challenges facing the Commission, and I think it would be really it's an important sign of the commitment of the press and the media and journalists in Ukraine, of their commitment to independence and ethical values in journalism. Andrei, would you like to explain to us, how the Commission is working and what really more needs to be done in order to support the work that you're carrying out?
Indicatively enough, at the moment, Commission is almost back to normal, because during the first weeks of the full-scale invasion, we were looking into some examples of using hate speech, and also about propaganda and counter-propaganda. But when the situation on the front has more or less stabilized, approximately from August or maybe September last year, well, the complaints that we are looking into returned back to almost what we had before the full-scale invasion. And this is about intrusion into privacy. This is about alleged damage to personal and business reputation and all this kind of stuff. And this, of course, is an indication of the viability of Ukrainian journalism and viability of our audiences. And the connection with the audiences is a key to what we do or try to do. On my personal side, I would like to 100% support what Lina has told. I admire the work that the National Union of Journalists does. I read their news regularly, and if I had more time on my radio, I would every day report on the interesting and important things that they do. But even the airtime is not endless, so I only report on them from time to time. However, now probably a leap forward a bit, a leap towards what our foreign colleagues can do, apart from what Lina has said. And one of the important things to my mind is to try to understand that this is not a new conflict. This is not something that started on the 24th of February of 2022. This is the continuation of at least 9 years of the war that was in Ukraine, this was there in Ukraine, launched by Russia, and which was not very popular to make note of, both in the foreign media, and sometimes in Ukraine, because the moods have been changing together with the stages of the conflicts. And even we had a tendency, let's say from 2017 or 2018, to call it the war in the east of Ukraine, thus trying to distance ourselves from the war and to distance the war from ourselves. It was there. And much of the discussion and much of the actions that we are doing now, that we're engaged in now, in reality, they were present in the Ukrainian journalistic milieu since 2014 or even earlier. Aidan was absolutely right when he reminded us that Ukrainian journalists have often been the target of those people who have power and money, and those our colleagues who were telling, let's say, unpleasantries to the powers that be were targets of persecution and sometimes prosecution. Also, of course, this has found a new dimension during the full-scale invasion, and the discussion about how you can remain objective during the war was a flare again, as in 2014 or 2015. My personal opinion, shared by some of the colleagues, is that you cannot be neutral during such times of trials and tribulations, but you still can be objective and understand that if you tell truth, unpleasant truth about your country, about what's happening on your side of the front, this leads to the audience getting a fuller picture, sometimes complete picture, sometimes not complete picture, because some things will become known for sure only after the war ends, and no one knows when this war will end. But as you know, if we apply this principle to tell truth, nothing but the truth and the whole truth, then I think that we can tell truth and nothing but the truth. The whole truth will become known later, but it still remains our aim to dig out this whole truth. So in order to understand and put the events in Ukraine in the context, I think we shall admit that the conflict, the war, the aggression has been there for many, many years. At the moment, I think that in the Ukrainian Journalistic Guild, there's still not enough clarity about whether we can fight propaganda with propaganda, or we should juxtapose propaganda with information, with facts, with fact-finding. And I think that in many cases we forget about the replacement therapy, I would say, because it is not enough and sometimes not very productive to just reveal or reveal the lies that are spread about Ukraine. You have to offer both internal and external audience a truthful, interesting, and easily digestible information, so that they go to you for the news and reports and analysis instead of going to other sources. And to make them go to you, you have to be close to earth, close to the ground, as close to the truth as humanly possible, and to know and not be afraid to provide the answer why sometimes it is not possible to tell the whole truth. And of course, we know that there are limitations which are reasoned by the martial law and other war circumstances. And while some of them most of the colleagues accept as necessary, like a lag between the missile hit and the time when we can report where it actually hit, and the publication of the names of injured and so on and so forth. Some of them seem to curb the freedom of reporting, like the recent decision by Ukrainian military authorities that there should be 3 zones for reporting, and not everyone can get to the red zone, not everyone can get to the orange or yellow zone, but of course everyone can work in the green zone. In some cases, this does put limits on what we can do. So basically, and again, what the National Union of Journalists does in relation to local media is absolutely indispensable and absolutely admirable. I work for a third sector radio station. We are owned by a public organization, and we do not broadcast over the entire country. We have limited broadcasting areas, but we know that when some of the regions in some of the areas in Kiev region or in Kharkiv region were occupied by the Russians, radio remained the only source of information from the free territory, and people started to dig out their old transistor receivers from their lofts or from their cellars and listen to it. And the same happens to the printed press. While, of course, many of us have heard final verdicts written and pronounced both for radio and for printed press. And this shows that the mission of media during the war is to save lives. And local press and local radio, and radio in particular, that's my personal opinion, are the best suited means for this. And to save lives, you have to tell people the truth. You have to inform them about what is safe, what is unsafe, and where our people who are in power may be doing something wrong. That's why the investigative journalism in Ukraine also lives, also works. And those, I think, who are truly patriotic do not mind that we get to know some unpleasant things about ourselves during this. With this, I rest my case.
Much indeed. I mean, I think you've really highlighted the value of, even in the midst of a conflict, the value of the authorities having critical friends in the media who will be very much supportive of the war effort, but at the same time will want to be able to voice criticisms which are legitimate and opinions which are some people in power find difficult to take. And I think one of the great and remarkable things that's been happening in Ukraine is that investigative journalism has continued. There has been exposure of corruption and so on. And there's a simple reality, to put that in a stark contrast, that journalists who in Moscow who would have tried to do the same thing would have been arrested, charged, and put in jail as a result of the sort of the suppression of sort of basic press freedom rights. So I think what you've highlighted here is sort of, again, a testament to the great work that's being done. Okay, I want to move along to our panel now, not in Ukraine. And first of all, I want to ask who's online with us, Jean Chevalier from Reporters Without Borders. Jean, it's great that you've been able to join us. And tell us, because I think RSF has done a fantastic amount of work, and I should say that the Ethical Journalism Network is establishing a new and a good relationship with RSF in the months to come, and that's a really good thing for us. And I know that RSF is doing some really fantastic and terrific work in terms of solidarity. So tell us a bit about that.
Oh, Thank you. Hello, Aiden and all the panelists. Thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to speak and to discuss with you. Thank you very much for the very interesting testimonies we've heard. We just heard from Nuju and from Andre. And also just one thing. My name is Jeanne Cavelier. Sorry, not Chevalier. And I'm the head of Eastern Europe and Central Asia desk. So now I will explain to you what we've done this more than a whole year in Ukraine. So first, to support Ukrainian media and journalists, first we try to protect journalists and media. Second, to raise awareness and to fight impunity. And third, to fight propaganda. So I will try to be not very long, but to explain to you. So the first point is to protecting journalists and media. So not a long time after the full-scale invasion, we started to open the Lviv and Kiev press freedom centers. So with our partner IMI, the Institute of Mass Information. And now, thanks to these centers, we have supported more than 1,000 journalists and fixers in Ukraine with safety equipment, loan of helmets and bulletproof jackets, but also energy equipment. We've provided training to 365 journalists, and it can be it was physical safety trainings, medical first aid trainings, psychological trainings. Also we have, since we have UNESCO here, I can mention also we translated into Ukrainian with Nuju last year the UNESCO and RSF handbook on journalist safety. The website, RSF training website, is also about safety, is also available in Ukrainian. We also offer psychological support to journalists. It can be through our platform, online platform with our partner Utelmed, or we can finance several sessions with psychologists on the ground for journalists who prefer to, who have already chosen psychologists. Also, very important, we provide financial support. We provided already for 160 journalists and 30 media outlets, mostly small, not only, but mostly small media outlets on the front line, because as the panelists said earlier, it's very important for the people who are really near the front line to be informed for their own safety and to fight propaganda. And soon we will provide a residency program in Western Ukraine to help media professionals to resist the challenges such as burnout or distress, to restore their psychological state, and to provide them with emotional resource to continue doing their job. And we will do that in Western Ukraine, so the male journalist will be able to follow it also. My second point was raising awareness and fighting impunity. So first, we monitor every day the press freedom situation in Ukraine. So now, within our mandate, we have counted 11 journalists killed and 24 injured. We have a map of exactions updated on our website. And we filed already in total 17 complaints to the ICC and to the International Criminal Court and to the Ukrainian prosecutor. We also do investigation and strategic litigation, I've told you already, but investigations on several emblematic cases like Max Levin's execution or Dmytro Khilyuk disappearance in Russia. And for instance, my colleague in charge of the investigation desk was in Ukraine 2 weeks ago, and he found new elements about Khilyuk's location in Russia because he changed his prison. So it's important to work on that and to raise awareness on this kind of cases among the public, but also to the prosecutors, Ukrainian and international prosecutors. We also advocate to the general public. So it's communication about cases to raise the public awareness on the social importance of the journalists in Ukraine and on the war against information waged by the Kremlin. It can be through press releases, through reports, tweets, videos, participation in conferences, and other actions. We also advocate to the Ukrainian institutions, of course, for them to prioritize the investigations on crimes against journalists. And because you know that without journalists, we can't know the truth, and we can't know freedoms, that if freedoms are respected or not. And we also promote the quality journalism to the Ukrainian institutions. We make our critiques and recommendations to the government. For instance, we spoke about accreditation of journalists, about the National News Marathon, and so on. My third one was about fighting against Russian propaganda. So it can be through talks with YouTube, which is quite difficult to set up, but we manage step by step to set up a real discussion with them. It's through the GX Fund that we launched last year. It's a fund for journalism in exile, so that media outlets that had to, and journalists that had to flee their country can come back to journalism very quickly in their home, in their host country abroad. We found through the GX Fund media from Russia, Belarus, but also from Ukraine. Another way to fight Russian propaganda is through the satellite package we will launch with Russian-speaking independent channels. With Eutelsat, we managed to prevent Eutelsat to broadcast 3 propaganda channels in Russia. And instead of these channels, we are building right now, and it will be out soon, a satellite package of independent channel. We also have the collateral freedom operation to circumvent the censorship through mirror sites. So it's exactly the same websites, but it's host in a server that is very difficult for the authorities to block. So any media outlet can come to us, and we freely develop mirror sites for them. So we have many requests from different countries, sometimes also requests from non-Russian media outlets that are blocked in Russia but want to be unblocked also in Russia, for instance. And we launched very recently in June with NewsGuard the Journalism Trust Initiative in Ukraine. So the Journalism Trust Initiative, it's a mechanism to promote the trustworthiness of information and to fight disinformation. So in our view, it's very important, especially in Ukraine. That's why we did this partnership with NewsGuard to very closely follow the 25 newsrooms that volunteered to be certified with the Journalism Trust Initiative. But maybe some people in the audience don't know. So the GTI is it's like an ISO norm. It's based on a standard for the trustworthiness of news and information. It has been developed under the aegis of the European Committee for Standardization. It has 18 clauses to cover the institutional and process level of journalistic production. For instance, ownership, transparency, editorial guidelines, independence, correction policies, and so on. It's like an ISO norm. You have 130 questions to answer. And at the end of the process, the media outlet can be certified, and it can help, especially the Ukrainian media, to get an economic boost, because it can be used for them to promote the way they are making news, the fact they are independent among advertisers, among donors, and of course among their own public. And thank you very much for listening to me, and I'm ready to answer your questions if you have some.
Thanks very much indeed. We'll come back to that later on. The Journalism Trust Initiative is a really important project. We in the Ethical Journalism Network worked with RSF and in the development of that, including in producing the editorial guidelines. It's a great self-certifying system which helps to identify media that are trustworthy and reliable. And given the the scope for misinformation and disinformation and online misinformation, it's really an important development. Thanks very much for that, and thanks for the detail, Jeanne, on the work that RSF is doing. I want to go back when one's talking about trust. Perhaps now, if I can turn to the colleagues who are here with me, Jean-Paul Matos. The question of building trust is enormously important, and journalists themselves are really conscious of that responsibility that they have to be trustworthy. And one of the biggest, most difficult challenges they face in reporting a conflict is to do so and at the same time stick close to the moral value of ethical independence and not be biased. Well, in Ukraine, that's extremely difficult for the journalists on the ground. They want to be supporting the war effort, and they also want to stick close to their moral values. I mean, how can they do that?
Well, thank you, Aidan, for inviting me to take part in this very interesting discussion. I have to say that my reflection will be very close to those of Andrei Kulikov. I mean, although they will be based mostly on my observation of how international journalists operate in regard of the Ukraine conflict. It's true that our war is a major test for journalists and media freedom. It raises the bar of journalistic responsibilities, especially if journalists report on a conflict in which their own country has taken side, which is the case for most Western European journalists, for instance, but also especially for Ukraine, where the country is directly engaged, and where the survival of the country is at stake. Restrictions of their work are inevitable, and many of these restrictions are reasonable. But in a democracy, these measures related to access to the front lines, for instance, or censorship, must be open to debate so that journalists can play the role they are supposed to assume in a democracy, and especially in a democracy at war. And I would say that our first task of journalists is to prove that the famous saying, the conventional wisdom saying that truth is the first casualty of war, is not acceptable. It is part of their mission to contradict that saying. Let's remember that in the Second World War, for instance, the rules applying to censorship were only applicable to security-related issues. They were not applied to policy issues. It happened during the Second World War that journalists, and the most prominent journalists like Ed Murrow or E.J. Liebling or Ives Sloan, they very seriously criticized positions taken by the US government, even military decisions, like, for instance, during the North African invasion, they criticized the fact that the US Army was trying to placate the French collaborationist army against the Gaullists. Even John Patton, who was the most famous general in the US Army, was exposed by the media because he had slapped a GI, a soldier who had been affected by trauma in the hospital, and he was demoted and displaced by General Eisenhower. So this is the kind of clear guideline that we have to make. Let's separate what is security related from what is policy related. During the Second World War, there was a major vacuum in the way the US journalists and British journalists covered the war. They didn't really cover war crimes by their own forces or strategic bombing, the effects of strategic bombing on cities. It changed with the Vietnam War. It's interesting to retrace a little bit the history of journalists. It changed with the famous My Lai massacre investigation by Seymour Hersh in 1968. Today, for journalists, I mean, they're expected to hold their own authorities accountable on issues which determine the moral clarity of their cause. This is something which is considered today as part of ethical journalism. Recently, this was solemnly affirmed in an Australian court when investigative journalists of the Australian Broadcasting Corporation and a few mainstream media were vindicated for exposing the crimes allegedly committed by Australian special forces in Afghanistan. It's part of the discussion today of the use of banned anti-personnel mines or cluster munitions by both sides in the Ukraine war. It's an issue which is at the heart of the moral clarity of the cause. A democracy and its ally are not supposed to violate international humanitarian law. Of course, yes, these reporting decisions are very tough to take, especially when journalists feel close to a country which has been brutally aggressed and submitted to an unprovoked war and its abominable consequences of civilian casualties, war crimes, occupation. In the case of the Ukraine war, we are to some extent in a similar scenario as during the siege of Sarajevo in the 1990s, where many correspondents practice what Martin Bell of the BBC called the journalism of attachment. Like today in Ukraine, they were faced by an old-fashioned morality tale of good versus evil, of the Goliath versus David, the illegality of the war, the indiscriminate shelling of civilian areas, the commission of war crimes, and Western governments' united front against what they see as Putin's revanchism have inevitably drawn a clear line in the sand. Who in the journalistic community today wants to provide comfort to the enemy or feed its propaganda machine by revealing facts that reflect poorly on the country one feels close to? Who wants to be seen as bashing the victim? This is the core dilemma of most journalists, and especially of international journalists covering the Ukraine war. The dilemma, of course, may be solved in different ways, depending on journalists' own feelings. And my purpose is not to judge colleagues to take a different path than mine, but ethically, there's, I think, only one way out of the dilemma, is telling the truth, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts, as Le Monde founder Hubert Beuve-Méry famously said. The duty of a war reporter is to confront the uncomfortable, said Jamie Detmer recently in a Politico article. However uncomfortable, and regardless of whether it is used for propaganda or twisted by a brutish aggressor, the press is still duty-bound to tell the truth. Applying to all the actors in war the same criteria as required by the impartiality doctrine is not falling into moral equivalence. Russian war crimes are systemic and massive, and journalists have been documenting them as fast and as rigorously as possible, not only to establish the truth, but also to contribute to justice and to the fight against impunity. But the good guys, or the side we feel close to, should not be exempted from scrutiny, especially since they have made the values of democracy and freedom the pillar of their narrative. Uncomfortable stories which contradict the pro-Western, anti-Russian discourse which dominates the coverage of the war in the West must also be told. Truth-seeking without fear or favor, criticism of flawed policies, principled dissent should be seen by democracies as an asset in a war. By highlighting official mistakes, abuses, or lies, independent journalism protects the country's reputation and helps to prevent or correct acts which might undermine military efficiency, public approval, or international support. This is a lesson of the Vietnam War, as Hannah Arendt brilliantly demonstrated in her 1971 essay in the New York Review of Books, Lying in Politics, a reflection on Pentagon Papers, a conflict which, at the time, former Defense Secretary Clark Clifford had said was based on false premises and was allowed to continue and to lead to a defeat because too few in the media or inside the Beltway dared to say the truth. This is the lesson that Craig Whitlock draws in this book, Afghanistan Papers, published 2 years ago and based on declassified official documents. And he says, explicit and sustained efforts by the US government to deliberately mislead the public led to the disaster. And it is a lesson of the investigation of the Kiev Independent into abuses and mismanagement of the International Legion a couple of months ago, which was rewarded by a European Press Prize. And I quote the head of investigation of the Kiev Independent, Anna Mikonyuk, who said, "We are living in a democratic society in Ukraine, and any form of misdeed and corruption must be put to an end. Our audience shared our views on this. The only way to strike back propaganda is telling the truth. Our soldiers are defending not only our territorial integrity, but also our values. It is so important to have an active society, to have journalism in place which combats corruption. It shows Ukraine is very different from Russia," end of quote. And I will quote a famous senator in the history of the US, of the United States during the Vietnam War, which can be a sort of guiding norm for journalists as well, not only for public officials. Senator William Fulbright at the time, in 1996, was the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He was not a subversive, was not a communist. And he said in his speech called Dissent as a Higher Form of Patriotism, and I quote him, "To criticize one's country is to do it a service and pay it a compliment. It is a service because it may spur the country to do better than it is doing. It is a compliment because it evidences a belief that the country can do better than it is doing. Criticism is more than a right. It's an act of patriotism, a higher form of patriotism, I believe, than the familiar rituals of national adulation," end of quote. Thank you.
Jean-Paul, thank you very much indeed. I mean, I think you have really honed in on one of the really key objectives of our report, which is that, you know, to take the cliche about truth telling and to convert it into a working reality for good journalism in Ukraine and around Ukraine. And I think that really is one of the most important things we have to do. So we need to create the conditions in which there is political respect for journalists who wish to express criticism and do so in a professional manner. They should have the freedom to do so. And there are many politicians who, unfortunately, have a knee-jerk response to media criticism, which tends to resist it and to try to be secretive in the way that they deal with it. And I think in this time, you've rightly sort of highlighted the importance of it. It also, I think, is an issue for journalists. Journalists themselves need to be well-trained and capable and competent in order to have the confidence to be able to tell the truth. And I think that's why journalistic education and training is such an important issue, and it figures very strongly in our report. We're very grateful for the work that was done by the Destin Project, who have supported this. And what they did, their project was to support the quality of education and in MA courses and BA courses in journalism being organized by Ukraine universities. And they got together 10 universities in Ukraine and were able to sort of put together sort of a program of support which is designed to help and improve the quality of training. And I think that whole question of education and preparing the next generation of journalists to be able to deal with when this war will end, and it will end at some point, for the media landscape that will have to be created at that time. And so therefore, let's, if I can quickly go on to my last two colleagues who've joined us here today. Adeline, you're working with UNESCO. UNESCO has a very specific and supportive role to play, not just in terms of free expression, but also in the field of education and so on. So I'd really like to know what UNESCO is doing these days around Ukraine.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you so much, Aidan, and good morning, everyone. Thanks a lot for this invitation to join this panel discussion, but also to launch this important launch and report. And going back to the report, I think it's a very important one. I enjoyed very much reading it because it gives a really interesting picture, as was just mentioned before, about the situation and the media landscape in Ukraine before the war, but also right now, and some of the challenges that existed before, like the issue of ownership, disinformation, but also highlights how the media landscape and media right now have been affected by the war. And we've heard like very interesting testimonies from our colleagues in Ukraine, and how journalists have become overnight purveyors of life-saving information. And at the same time, really, an interesting part of the report is about the information distribution and audience engagement, and how much the viewers have been drifting away from television, turning to social media, especially Telegram, but also how this is raising some journalistic ethical standards and the need for specific education in that respect. And beyond the analysis, as you mentioned at the beginning, there are a lot of recommendations and concrete actions. And needless to say that these recommendations are very much in line with UNESCO's actions and work in Ukraine and engagement since the beginning of the war. And I don't really want to repeat what was said before, because indeed we've heard from RSF, from NUJU, from the Ethical Journalism Commission, a lot of what has been done. Maybe just to say that as coordinator of the UN Plan of Action on the Safety of Journalists and the issue of impunity, a lot of UNESCO's work and priority has been about the providing safety to journalists and monitoring crimes against journalists in the country. We've mentioned and we've heard with RSF, but NUJU as well, the establishment of this network of Journalist Solidarity Center, providing education with also like legal advice and training to journalists, and how this has been very important, with more than 700 journalists that have been trained on those issues. But another area of the work of UNESCO has been very much centered on ensuring the continuity of the work in the country, among others, the relocation of some offices of NUJU and the Independent Media Trade Union to safer area, but also the support to local media and hyper-local media. We've been also providing more than 40 hyper-local media outlets with energy equipment for them to continue operating, and also launch a specific program with the World Food Programme to provide hundreds of journalists with basic income to continue their work informing the population. But as you say, the recommendation goes beyond the continuity and ensuring safety of journalists. It's also about, a lot in the report is about education, it's about media literacy and media development. And here UNESCO has been also right now quite active in supporting the Commission on, the CGE, Commission on Journalism Ethics, to right now, for instance, develop an updated handbook for journalists and students. And right now, they are actually carrying out an independent needs assessment amongst journalism professors to understand better what are the needs here for right now and for the future in terms of education. Separately in terms of education, but we've been also providing through the Heritage Fund, we're documenting damages to cultural sites and the resilience of the cultural sector in Ukraine through photojournalism, and providing here capacity building and training to support journalists, around 65 right now, to document the impact of the war on the cultural sector in the country. And just very quickly and lastly, we've talked about education, the need for journalist education, but we also need to improve and to work on media literacy and media information literacy. I think this is something, there are some striking figures in the report about that need and about the fact that there is a huge part of the population that does not necessarily have the critical thinking skills in order to distinguish like disinformation propaganda from truthful information. So this is also an area where UNESCO is being very active, is into developing and engaging with to provide better education of citizens on how to understand and engage with online media on all platforms. And to actually work on the urgent need for wide-reaching media literacy campaigns targeting all segments of the population in all regions in the country. And I'll just stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I mean, I think, again, you've highlighted and reinforced some of the points that have been made already about the need to build trust within the audience, in the public at large. Jeanne has referred to that in terms of the work that's being done also by RSF through the Journalism Trust Initiative and so on. So this question of building trust seems to be absolutely important. So we need to support the journalists in their wish to acquire the skills that are necessary in order to be investigative journalists, for example, is going to be one issue. We need to create a political environment which is going to be allowing a critical independent journalism to function, and we need to, above all, to sort of ensure the safety of journalists. That's quite clear. All of these issues are really on the minds of the media development community at the moment, Tom. So can you tell us a little bit about what the global media development community is doing to focus support for Ukraine?
Thank you, Aidan. Yes, well, I'm very privileged to work for the Secretariat of the Global Forum for Media Development, and our mandate comes from our over 140 members, including the EJN, including the big international INGOs that are responding to the crisis in Ukraine, and national organizations such as NUJU, who we have with us today. And it's that platform and that mandate which kind of gives myself and the other members of the Secretariat the kind of platform to speak in these kinds of fora on behalf of the sector. We've been supporting our members and other colleagues in Ukraine by creating a fundraising guide in Ukrainian. But most importantly, we kicked off a coordination effort, an information sharing effort within 48 hours of the invasion, and that has enabled kind of better coordination between various actors, mapping who's doing what, briefings on certain topics, and also joint advocacy. So last year at the festival in Perugia, International Journalism Festival, we facilitated a declaration in support of Ukrainian media, and it was signed by over 200 organizations. And it's very important to say that the drafting of that declaration was led by Ukrainian colleagues, and it includes very clear advocacy requests and recommendations on international media assistance, donors and intergovernmental organizations, tech platforms and advertising, and also to international media in the way they report in terms of avoiding false equivalence or involving, as was noted earlier, the kind of journalism of attachment. And we've been using this declaration as the platform for our advocacy work over the last year and a half. And, you know, one of the main things that we do is to remind donors who support Ukrainian media and others that the global figure of 0.3% of overseas development assistance goes to media. And that is too low, and that is unacceptable, and it's been too low for too long. And of that fraction of overseas development assistance, only a fraction of that actually reaches the countries themselves, and too much of it is spent outside of the country by international intermediaries, and that's something that we want to see changed. Now, Ukraine does, comparatively to other countries, has historically always received a large, significant amount of support to journalism, and that has increased over the last year and a half, understandably. There are signs that there is some fatigue in the donor community to supporting Ukrainian journalism, and we really want to make sure that is addressed. But almost as important as the amount of support is how support is structured. So, for example, we've held a consultation with the Journalism Funders Forum, hosted by Filia, with the Media Development Foundation Ukraine, Lviv Media Forum, the Fix, on how philanthropy can better support Ukrainian media, and you can find the details of that on our website. Now, as journalists, we are familiar with the principle of doing no harm. But what does this mean in terms of international media support? So many of us in this room, and I'm sure Ukrainian colleagues online, will have, I think, over especially maybe in recent times, but also before, been asked to indulge in a more counter-narrative approach or a strategic communications approach to their journalism based on the motivation and the intended outcomes of who is giving that support. So I don't know if people online listening have perhaps felt that their editorial agenda is sometimes skewed based on the topics which donors are willing to support. And we have seen, rightly so, lots of support for reporting on war crimes, responding to disinformation, etc. But if the support that's given is only in the frame of countering disinformation, then that will not adequately serve the needs of audiences and their broader needs as audiences as well. And over time, that'll be corrosive in terms of the trust which audiences have in journalism. So I think we have to ask the question about whether or not we are actually living up to some of the very trendy words in our sector, like decolonization and localization. These localization has been buzzwords for years, but have we actually changed the power dynamics between donors and those who are the recipients of funding? Are need assessments done by trusted national actors rather than by external experts? Are trusted national actors being given the tools to lead, or are they junior partners in projects that are dominated by international organizations? And is media support always given through the prism of responding to disinformation rather than making a more positive case for journalism's role as a public good, as so clearly articulated by UNESCO in the Windhoek +30 declaration? And sometimes a complaint that we often have from our members is that they can only get funding for fact-checking and media literacy, whereas the fundamental support they need is often quite different. And that's the kind of practical danger if we don't actually provide holistic and genuine solidarity. And sometimes we do live up to these questions, and sometimes as a sector we don't. But we have to do better, and we have to make sure that we find a way that we can be really self-reflective and improve how, as a sector, we go about supporting Ukrainian media now and in the future in a way that is genuine solidarity and is led by their needs and not through the prism of being seen as a tool of foreign policy. Because if that approach is stronger than taking a much more holistic approach based on the principles of what we know media assistance can look like, then in the longer term we're going to undermine the ability of Ukrainian journalism, Ukrainian media to play the vital role that it has to. And just one quick nod to a previous project from the Ethical Journalism Network, which Aidan and I worked on, and that was around testimony of journalists at international war crimes tribunals. Now, at the moment, journalists are gathering evidence and information on war crimes that are happening in Ukraine, and at a certain point in time, we don't know when, there may be international war crimes tribunals. And at that point, the ethical questions exponentially increase, and we need to learn from past experiences in Yugoslavia and elsewhere, and make sure that the journalists who do decide to do that, and not all will, that they actually have the moral, legal, psychological and financial support they need to adequately and represent themselves and their work if they choose to do so in those fora.
Well, Tom, thank you very much indeed. I mean, that was really an extremely good intervention, because it actually puts on the table a number of very serious questions and challenges to the international community. I mean, that whole question about whether or not the international support is entirely dependent on seeing political and strategic objectives being realized by governments is a major question, and it seems to me that the international donor community and governments need to recognize that what they need to have in Ukraine and anywhere else where they're providing support is they need to have the sort of journalism that will be courageous enough and equipped and in an environment that enables them to do so, that will allow them to criticize everybody, including perhaps those who are actually providing support. That sort of question of independence of journalism is not a tap to be turned on and off according to the political and strategic needs of countries. And I think that's particularly important. For example, one of the reasons why I think we certainly think that independent journalism is important in Ukraine, and has been demonstrated to be so over the last recent months, has been in the question of, for example, exposing corruption, internal corruption. And Ukrainian journalists have actually shown great courage, but also great professionalism in being able to support the war effort, but at the same time to call out corruption within the state. And that's extremely important, and it will become more important, even more important, when the hundreds of billions of dollars and euros are going to start flowing into Ukraine for recovery and reconstruction programs. And it's going to be absolutely essential during that period that there is a media landscape in which journalists will have the confidence and the freedom to be able to do the work that's necessary in anti-corruption investigation. You will know, Tom, from your sort of previous experience, I mean, up to around 30% of all of the money that is sent into countries to rebuild and reconstruct after conflict, almost 30% disappears through various forms of corruption. And this has been the story in Iraq, in the Balkans, in Afghanistan, and so on. If that is not going to happen in Ukraine, it's going to require a cadre, a cohort of journalists who are able to keep an eye on what's going on and will have the skills to be able to investigate. And I think that, again, that's why that question of building the skills base of journalists is very important. I want to go back, if I can, to our colleagues in Ukraine. You've heard a lot of things that have been said here, which there is a lot of well-meaning commitment to building support for Ukraine. I'm particularly interested if you feel that there is what more can be done by the international community in order to connect with journalists and media in Ukraine to make sure that the support they're getting is targeted and is actually going to deliver what it really is needed from your perspective. Would either of you like to sort of comment on this issue and what you've heard so far? Lena?
Thank you for this question. I would like to react for previous speaker and said that maybe we as Ukrainian journalists, we should tell more about our work and about our success work, because it's a work of Ukrainian journalists who investigated the documents of Ministry of Defense, what led to adoption new law on the opening of public procurement. It's the work of Ukrainian journalists led to the resignation of some officials in Ukraine during the war. And Ukrainian journalists were the first who tell the stories of women suffered from conflict-related sexual violence. And despite of former Yugoslavia, we have no 8 or 9 years to wait when the women will be ready to tell about what happened with them. So the trust to Ukrainian media caused that women told their stories now, and it's very important. As to Ukrainian journalists' needs and Ukrainian media needs, they have different needs according to our survey, and all models of economical independence in Ukraine of Ukrainian media were destroyed. No incomes from advertisement, no incomes from any partners, and no incomes for salary for journalists. According to our survey, about every fourth journalist in Ukraine works without salary, and the median salary for a local journalist is about 200 euros per month. And the big problem for local media and for all Ukrainian media is a lack of professional journalists because of the war. Some journalists changed their work, some of them were relocated, and the journalists who are still working, they suffered from burning out, they suffered from relocation and many personal problems, or they are suffered of continue for shelling when they are living in the dangerous places in the war zones. So the maybe I would like to call all our partners to invest in people, to invest money, to invest attention, to invest all efforts to save the journalist team, to teach new journalists or the new people for journalists, and to give them technical equipment, give them skills, and give the newsrooms any basement for independence from politics and from politicians and from large business.
Indeed. Andre, is there anything you'd like to add?
Just 2 points. I support whatever as Lina has said now. I would like to thank Jean Cavalier because I suppose that the bulletproof jacket that I own, at least until the end of the war, comes from your organization, because I got it from the EIMI. And I also want to recall a story. In March last year, I got a call from a producer at the CNN from America, and she was asking where I was broadcasting from at that time. And I said, I'm broadcasting from my kitchen. And she said, and what do you do when the air alert sounds? I said, I go to my bathroom and continue to broadcast from there. And she says, you know, your corridor may be safer. And then I remember that when she introduced herself, there was a Slavic sounding name ending with ich. So I asked her, are you from Bosnia? And she says, yes, originally I'm from there. And this is, for me, was a huge inspiration that a person finds 15 or even 10 seconds to give an advice to a colleague separated by thousands of miles. And she cares. And I know that many, many colleagues the world over care. Same as we care about the world. Thank you for your thoughtful analysis. Thank you for telling us some things that help put the situation into context. And thank you for trying to understand us.
Thank you very much indeed. I have to say it's been a very fruitful, if sobering, discussion in terms of outlining the many complex and different issues. I wonder, Jeanne, is there anything you would like to add?
Yeah, yes. Yes, sorry. Yeah, just to maybe to underline the fact that the Russian continue to strike civilians and to strike to strike journalists, and this has to be fighted on. We have to fight against this strike in court. So we need to fight against impunity again and again. I think that beyond protecting journalists, that's our very important role as international organization right now.
Thanks very
Not
much.
to forget.
Thank you very much. I mean, I think that's absolutely right. I have to say, I think the international community must step up to make sure that everyone who is guilty of war crimes, of attacks on journalists and news media are held accountable. That's absolutely a starting point for bringing justice to bear in this terrible conflict. I think that takes us really to the end of what we've been talking about this morning. I just want to highlight again the major issues that we've talked about, and I think which are reflected in the report. I hope you'll all be able to sort of read it and follow it. What we're looking for here is that there needs to be more international support, more governmental support, and more support which is not directed solely at the political and strategic interests of states, but is actually directed towards supporting independent, ethical journalism and news media. That there needs to be a really useful and working partnership, which is in place, but needs to be developed with Ukrainian media and Ukrainian journalists. There needs to be an understanding of the importance of local journalism and how local journalism, particularly in the area where the conflicts are taking place, needs to be given priority. There needs to be, above all, support for journalists and support for people who want to get into journalism. So more efforts to improve the quality of education in journalism, and so on. There needs to be more investment in investigative journalism, and there needs, above all, to be more practical support for journalists. That means, and we've heard something, Lena has been very honest about the very low wages and the poor conditions in which journalists are working in Ukraine. The international community needs to recognize that this is an area where more support is to be given. So if this war is to be fought to a successful conclusion, it will only be done on the basis of an information landscape which is not toxic, which is not polluted by misinformation and propaganda, but in which reliable streams of information are provided by confident and competent journalists on the spot. I think that's really what the main demands of our report are: to recognize the problem, look for practical solutions, and to take urgent action to have those solutions brought into effect. So thank you all very much for joining me this morning. It's been really illuminating. It's been good to hold this meeting here in Brussels, which is one of the political centers where support for Ukraine is constantly under discussion. And it's really important for us to make sure that when support for Ukraine is now discussed, that the issue of media freedom and independent journalism is given the priority status that it deserves. Thank you all very much from Ukraine and from here in Brussels for taking part. And good luck to you all, and best of luck for everyone. And please do have a look at our report, and we hope that you'll be able to use it to promote more support for our colleagues in Ukraine. Thanks very much.